Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're well today. Apparently this is my most French looking t-shirt, so I hope you enjoy that. Today we're going to be discussing three, broadly speaking, different types of theories of type, meta type kind of approach, if you like. We have different personality systems: MBTI, the Jungian cognitive functions, C.S. Joseph, objective personality, cognitive type, and so on and so forth. I think that we can actually provide a nomenclature or classification into three. There's three different kinds of these systems, and it really helps to clarify that, as we will see in a second. At least it's a working kind of definition I have in mind. So it probably is a work in progress for me as well. So hopefully you can help me progress that. Now, before I move on, the Ecstatic Soul, my book on the INFJ, check it out. All the links below. Would I be so arrogant as to pretend or claim it's the authoritative work on the INFJ so far? Make up your mind. Less than $10, links below. And my novel, The Infinite Castle, which you can also get for less than $10, ebook, paperback, just like the Ecstatic Soul. If you're into Dostoevsky, Kafka, Camus, existentialism, postmodernism, and a main character rumored to be on a healthy INFJ, that interests you. Check it out as well, links below. I have a Patreon page that you can also follow, and it really helps. Thank you to my supporters. Anywhere from membership from €3 a month, and interactions with me, some bonus content. There are advantages, and it really helps the channel. So I appreciate you. Okay, so what are these different types of personality systems? Types of theories of type. Having reflected on the question for a bit, I've come to this working definition whereby I think there are three main kinds. Okay, there's the kind that I would call the conservative system, right? Conservative framework, conservative theory of type. So keep this one in mind, conservative. The second one I call investigative. And the third one I call discursive, okay? So for the sake of this video, we'll be focusing on these three and look at them a bit more in detail. So the conservative system, the investigative system, and the discursive system. So very broadly speaking, what are these? Because this is not going to be a super long video, and we can explore this topic in more detail if there is interest in the future. So the conservative systems, the conservative frameworks, okay, are essentially frameworks to explore personality, right? Including types like INFJ and other types, that are really concerned with being faithful to an original source. Now, the vast majority of the time, the source is Jung, but sometimes the source can include authors since Jung that have interpreted Jung, that have perhaps systemized Jung or clarified Jung, such as John Beebe, for example, or it could be other authors as well. So it's important to appreciate that for the people who subscribe or who relate to the communities around conservative frameworks, really the main criterion of whether it's worth engaging with a particular framework, a theory of type, is its faithfulness to that original source, which is why I could call it conservative. No value judgment in here, just like if I were to talk of a political conservative or a religious conservative, it would not involve a value judgment, but more descriptive ascription, okay? So I think you'll find that there are people who are concerned to develop approaches to typing others that reflect what they believe is in Jung, is in Beebe, and so on and so forth. So they don't worry as much about truth as a cardinal value of a system as the next category of framework, which we'll discuss briefly, which I call the investigative framework. The investigative framework cares more about truth and does not take for granted that what Jung says is true. Can be improved. Maybe none of what Jung says is true. Everything is up for grabs. It has this more scientific kind of DNA in itself, at least an aspiration. The conservative frameworks, they're a little bit like, if you want to use an analogy, they're a little bit like, again, a conservative biblical scholar versus a liberal one. Like someone who thinks the Bible is inerrant, for instance. An evangelical Christian would the equivalent would be a conservative theorist. Okay. There are sections of the community that are pretty large, like the sections of the JCF community, Jungian Cognitive Functions, that would identify, they might not identify with the label conservative, but they would fall under this. Elements of the JCF community that do, they care a lot about that. People who also bring it to a more advanced level of systematization or attempt to systematize, such as Acromant, for example. But I would argue that at least when it started, possibly evolved a bit since then, because systems can change. The system of C.S. Joseph is a conservative system. It is primarily whether it can be faithful to the word of a certain number of authors, Jung, Beebe, and other ones. It's not one that's predicated on truth, and it's not one that's predicated on efficiency or expediency, like the discursive system we'll discuss as a third system. There's other ones, but just to give you some instances. So that's the conservative. There's an authoritative source. Let's ensure that we use contemporary resources to make sure that we are as close to the source as possible, that we are faithful to the source. Then the investigative systems are different because their main cardinal virtue, the value that they want to align themselves with, is truth, which in the context of a theory of type has to, in some way or other, be tied to a scientific approach. And if you are going to be tied to a scientific approach, you have to connect your theory and your hypotheses and your predictions with a body of empirical evidence, which you can then, collect in order to perform your tests and, be able to determine whether a prediction is true or not, which, over the long term, over the long run, also manages to, create respectability for the theory as an investigative theory that has this scientific ambition. The concern here is not really at all respect of an original source. What people care about when they subscribe to those frameworks is whether the theory says something true. They're really concerned to be able to establish a form of scientific truth that's repeatable, iterative, and so on and so forth. From this perspective, the writings of Jung, often are respected, as you'll notice that in these communities, Jung is talked about as often as someone who was a kind of a mystic, who saw through a power of intuition a lot of things that now deserve to be further elaborated, clarified, systematized, made scientific. And therefore, very much implied in this is the idea that Jung was not completely correct. He had some really good intuitions, and he contributed to starting a movement, but now we really have to get beyond that and attain more scientific respectability. Whether what the theory says is true is the cardinal question, not whether it is faithful to what the meanings that Jung intended. So in this category, I think there's two obvious ones that come to mind. Objective personality and cognitive type. Now, it is possible that cognitive personality theory, CPT, also falls under this, but I'm a little bit less familiar with this one, so I just hold, I just leave it aside, not to say that it's not worth exploring. A lot of people think it's great. I think it does belong in this category, but don't take my word for it. But cognitive type is the cardinal example, still very much in this frame. I think objective personality started out as this, but in the face of the very real difficulties with really maintaining a level of scientific, like respecting the demands of rigor and systematicity, and collecting evidence and constant reworking of the theory that's, a scientific approach requires. Objective personality, I think, has changed. It's maybe some people would argue it's changed very quickly. Some people who are more cynical would probably argue that it was never an investigative framework, but it was always a discursive framework, but that marketed itself as investigative in order to attract attention. But we could also consider, because there is some evidence that it started out as an investigative framework, if it remains relevant, because it still is relevant to a lot of people, I would argue it's because it's become discursively useful. And I think that ultimately the test of whether a theory is going to stand the test of time is whether it is discursively useful. So that leads us to our last category. Now, discursive frameworks, are the ones that, I'm not sure they are the best named. I tried to think of what I would call them. I thought of a Baroque framework. I thought of syncretic. I thought of discursive. And I thought, conservative, investigative, discursive. It sounded good because they all have the same suffixes. And ultimately Baroque is kind of weird, and syncretic is kind of technical. So I think discursive works well for these theories. Now, if I must announce it straight away, I think discursive frameworks are by far the ones that are embraced by most people in the community. Partly because discursive frameworks are not, they are not as systematic as either the conservative frameworks, which must make themselves systematic in order to attain their ideal of complete loyalty and faithfulness and fidelity to Jung, right? And the systematicity of the investigative frameworks is tied to the scientific approach, so goes without saying. Discursive frameworks, they're kind of your kind of catch-all. Like often they contain lots of different concepts from lots of different theories. They can be very rich. The vocabularies can be very rich, and when you talk to people, often they're not aware they belong to a framework. If they're not aware they belong to a framework, but they do use vocabularies, concepts from different places, and they kind of make it make sense together in this kind of not very systematic but expedient way that somehow works for them. It helps them make sense of their life situations. It helps them make sense of other people. It's good enough for them, and then sometimes it's more than just good enough. It can go very deep. Sometimes it can go deeper than the other ones because it is not restricted by this commitment to either this objective of scientific truth or absolute faithfulness to Jung or Bieber or others. So in a sense, it can be more exploratory. It has more freedom to be more exploratory because it's not tied to that. As long as it's expedient, as long as it's achieving some purpose for either a person or a community, the discursive frameworks is fine. It can, from the perspective of the other frameworks, it can be seen as what has to be removed because it could be seen as as the main reason why the people from completely outside personality theory see personality theory as pseudoscientific, because they are targeting, in fact, the discursive frameworks and not really paying enough attention to the investigative frameworks. Whereas the conservative frameworks, from this point of view, can almost be seen as like a Jung scholarship of some sort, right? So not trying to be science, so no point calling it pseudoscientific. But you could also argue that the discursive frameworks are what keeps personality communities alive, because they are literally what speaks to people, what helps people make sense of their everyday lives on a very concrete basis all the time. And my hypothesis, which I mentioned earlier in the video, is that other frameworks often can end up being relatively short-lived. And the condition for them not being short-lived is often that they progressively become slightly or completely discursive frameworks. That is to say, they maintain some of the vocabulary they originally had, either as conservative frameworks or as investigative frameworks, but as the limitations of either framework are more and more apparent, the question is, can they also then turn out to have vocabulary and a certain form of flexibility to be expedient for people and help them negotiate and solve practical problems of their everyday, or qualitative qualitative questions are there every day that can't be settled either through conservatism or through investigativism. And I think that to the extent that objective personality, for instance, is still relevant, it's because it has actually become a kind of discursive framework. It's a different one than the JCF discursive framework, because the JCF has a small part that is more, like I said, conservative, but most of JCF, and I would consider myself, or at least my channel, insofar as I do work on this channel, probably within the JCF larger community, as discursive. You know, like I could not do my investigations of the INFJ type if I were not within this field that is loose enough that it allows me a lot of leeway, theoretically, to explore many aspects. So ultimately, if you're not discursively relevant, whether you remain overall relevant is going to be very challenging and restricted. So in the case of an investigative framework, it would be to attain genuine scientific respectability, you know, as having your own scientific papers, having scientific reviews, being used by, you know, as a model by other people, as something that can be relied on scientifically. And again, you know, I think cognitive type itself, it still is very much has this investigative dimension, and it's admirably long-lived in this respect, and it's still very much going. But I think that it also has slowly, and unbeknownst to, I think, a lot of its adherents, become a discursive framework, mixed in with the elements of, you know, JCF discursive frameworks. But what happens with discursive frameworks, they tend to mix together, and people, when they are within a framework discussing a framework on purpose, they will speak the language of that framework, but when they speak more informally, you'll start noticing they mix a lot of different frameworks. And that's okay. If it's expedient, it helps them make sense of things, you know. But that was just my overview of those three main types: conservative, investigative, and discursive. Does that make any sense to you? And where do you sit yourself? So, like I said, for myself, conservative, it's not really something I'm that interested in. I mean, I'm interested in as an observer of my side, but to practice, not so much. I'm much more in the discursive realm, but I have also interest in the investigative realm. Because it's cool, you know, to sort of explore some cutting edge stuff. Even if perhaps in the long run, it mostly ends up informing what's discursive for me. But, you know, different approaches for different people. So yeah, keep me posted in the comments, guys. And don't forget it really helps to support my Patreon page. Links below. Thank you so much, and see you next week. Bye-bye.